It's great to welcome to the program today Alex Vitale, who's a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and also author of the book, The End of Policing. It's so great to have you on, Alex.
My pleasure, Dave.
So, this is extremely timely, and there's so many different things I want to ask about. You've been studying this issue of different policing practices and techniques. You've looked at militarization of law enforcement, the expansion of the role of police over the last 40 years. And right now, one of the big discussions that's happening in light of the George Floyd protests and what is, this is not my opinion, but according to polling, not a particularly good handling of policing and race relations by the current president. There are discussions about what should happen with police big picture. So, can you just to give us your 30,000-foot overview as someone who's been following this for a long time? The claims that are now being made are not new to you. What do you think is at the crux of the debate that's happening now?
Well, I think that following the police killing of Mike Brown and Ferguson and Eric Garner in New York and so many others, the Obama administration, a lot of big city mayors said, look, we're going to fix policing with a set of kind of procedural reforms. We're going to give them body cameras and implicit bias training and de-escalation training, and things are going to get better. And things have not gotten better. The situation out on the streets remains very problematic, and people are fed up with what they feel are these kinds of simplistic solutions. And so what's happening now is a demand to rethink why we're using the police in all the different ways that we're using them. Are they really the right people to respond to mental health emergencies? Are they the right people to deal with school discipline issues and a whole host of issues like that?
So, one of the things that sometimes I think makes these conversations difficult in terms of being productive is that the conversations sometimes exist imagining a different world than the one that actually exists. So, like, as an example, sometimes we hear there are countries in Europe where the default is not that police carry firearms. There's a team that has the firearms, and sometimes the firearms are left in the police cars. But as a rule, the police aren't walking around with firearms. Wouldn't that be something to look at? Now, that sounds very interesting to me. One key difference is those countries don't have the amount of armed civilians that the United States has. So is that a reasonable example of how we need to be dealing with things as they are as our starting point rather than things as we would wish them to be?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is an incredibly practical movement that is about turning people out to city council budget hearings and lobbying city council members. And yes, a lot of it is motivated by a kind of long range desire, a kind of aspirational vision about getting to this better world where guns are not something that people are walking around with as a general case. But I think everyone in this movement understands that's not the world we live in right now, and that this is about a process of creating safer communities by dialing back both problems in the communities and our over reliance on policing.
I want to get into the ideas that are very at a superficial level called either abolish or defund of police. Now, I did a piece about this a couple of weeks ago. My thought was there are sources of funding that should arguably be pared down, funding used for militarization, for example, funding used for certain types of weapons or equipment that really don't have a place on streets but are more for a battlefield. On the other hand, I'm aware of circumstances where pulling money may not actually help in the sense that we may have a police department that's already understaffed. An understaffed police department is likely to go after the lowest hanging fruit as they see it, which is let's send our limited police officers to the places that we currently believe have more crime. Of course, more police officers in one neighborhood are going to find more crime in that neighborhood, and it sort of perpetuates the problems we're actually trying to solve. So my instinct is that defund may be not precise enough in terms of a starting point, but I'm curious to hear what you think.
So, defund the police was not really a term that was in wide use before the current outbreak of protests. what was happening in dozens of cities across the country were very coherent campaigns about creating new public safety initiatives that people in those communities thought would actually make them safer than just relying on police. And what they would hear from local politicians was, well, there's no money to do that. And they were saying, yeah, but look, every year you've increased the police budget by 5%, 7%. They've got all this new money for all these tricked out tanks and surveillance equipment. And also, some of what the police are doing is actually counterproductive. We think it's actually harmful and destabilizing. So it's about really identifying specific evidence driven interventions to address specific public safety problems that allow us to dial back our reliance on policing, which has become this tool that's just being used to address everything.
What are the best examples of where that has worked without, as there are some who just oppose any reconsideration of how or when police are deployed under the guise that there will be more crime, it will be more dangerous, the public will be unprotected. What counterpoints do we have where these initiatives have worked?
Sure. Well, I think it's become pretty obvious to people that police should not really be in the mental health business. That between a quarter and a half of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis. And often the police play a destabilizing and escalating role in those conflicts and those crisis situations. And so that's why Albuquerque and Milwaukee and Los Angeles and a whole host of cities are now talking concretely about putting in place 24-hour crisis intervention capacities that would allow them to get the police out of that business. And a lot of them are looking at a model being used in Oregon called Cahoots, that's run by a nonprofit clinic that provides exactly this kind of 24-hour crisis response capacity for mental health calls, homeless people in distress, someone having a drug overdose, or some other drug-related, low-level crisis. And the folks in Oregon are extremely happy with the outcome of this approach, and I think we're going to see a lot more cities adopt it.
Now, as a purely logistical question, very often now it's not only police that show up, but it's also firefighters with a big fire truck, and that can sometimes be more aggravating to a situation than less. In these situations where you have mental health workers that are responding, is it mental health workers and fire, or is it just the mental health workers?
Well, there might be a need for an EMS response if the situation, potentially involves someone who might need medication or might need to be hospitalized. And there is a lot of talk about these co-response models where police would also respond with these teams, but the evidence on that is really thin, that the police presence is not really adding value to those encounters. There may be situations where a mental health team needs a backup at some point, but having the police there from the beginning of those interactions, much less a fire truck, that's generally not helpful. Though I would say that for someone having a crisis, it's precisely the fact that an armed police officer who is quite likely to arrest them or compel them to go to a hospital, that's what often makes these encounters dangerous in the first place. And so when we take that police response out of the mix, the chances of things going really south is greatly reduced.
When it comes to police training and when it comes to police training, let's open the question there. My instinct typically is that workers are in a position of disadvantage in many relationships with employers, and I'm supportive of unionization and collective bargaining, et cetera. There is a case to be made that some elements that might really improve policing, like, for example, a national database of bad actors, if you concede that most police individually are not problematic, but that a lot of the incidents are happening from a relatively small number of officers, some kind of national bad actor database where police departments are required to report to it, but also new police departments would be required to confer with the database to see if the person they're looking at hiring is on the database. That seems to me like it would be very powerful in eliminating the relatively small percentage of bad actors responsible for a lot of the bad acts, that's something I can't imagine unions would ever go for. What's your sense of something like that and how that should be navigated?
Well, I do think that a national database would be useful and support that. And there's interestingly some bipartisan support for it. We've seen um, police unions may not be as quick to object to that across the board as you might imagine, because I think in this moment of crisis, there's a little bit more openness among police leaders and police union leaders to try to do something about that small percentage of officers who generate the most complaints and who are are fired for clearly just reasons. Of course, this is not going to solve all the problems with policing, right? There's a lot of ways in which perfectly lawful, procedurally proper policing can still cause harms because we shouldn't be using police in that situation in the first place.
What's the lowest hanging fruit in general in terms of the things that could be done most quickly and easily that would have the greatest impact?
Well, in addition to the mental health example we discussed earlier, I think there's a lot of efforts underway to remove police from schools. I think this was a really misguided idea driven by some real misinformation about the nature of the problem. In Europe, they think we're crazy. They would never do this. We need to get police out of the mental health, out of the homelessness business, responding to homeless people who are clearly in distress. I think we need a rethink about the war on drugs. That's a bigger lift, but I think that we've got so much evidence that shows that turning that problem over to police is just such a bad idea.
What about the issue of police immunity, which is now being brought up? That I guess generally speaking, the idea that it's too easy for officers not to be held accountable in a particular way that some in the public would like to see because of immunity. I mean, that's certainly not low-hanging fruit in the sense that that would be a huge undertaking to look at that. But how much of a priority do you believe it should be?
Well, I don't think it should be a huge priority. I'm not against it, but I think there's a lot of fantasy thinking that this is going to be some kind of cure-all.
Mm.
And again, it assumes that all the problems with policing are about these small number of videotaped horrible incidents. And the problems of policing are also about the other 10 million arrests they make every year, many of them for things that just shouldn't be dealt with through policing. And so getting rid of QI is not going to affect that in any meaningful way. And I also think the political lift, as you mentioned, is going to be so hard on that it would be better to focus on creating these alternative community-based public safety initiatives and trying to focus on that instead.
When it comes to what some call over-criminalization, the fact that there are activities which are criminalized, and that's, of course, a societal choice to make. You mentioned the war on drugs, which certainly would be an example of that generally. But outside of the war on drugs, do you think over-criminalization is a problem? And what specific areas would you want to look at first?
Yeah, I think it is a major problem. The research by the Vera Institute of Justice showed that there are approximately 10 million arrests a year in the United States, and the vast majority of them are for very low-level offenses that are really tied to the broken windows philosophy of policing, which is about criminalizing and micromanaging the behavior of already very vulnerable communities. And it's a way of turning problems of poverty and joblessness and lack of health care into criminal justice problems. But that system doesn't have the tools that are going to help solve people's addiction problems, mental health problems, homelessness problems, joblessness problems. And that's really what we've seen over the last 40 years is the turning of all these social and economic problems into criminal justice problems. And that's why the problem is so much bigger than just a few officers with an abusive track record.
Isn't that by design in some sense? And now I feel like there is certainly a political split where there is a political contingent in the United States that, it's the same folks who they say they're against abortion, and you show them a study that says, great, we know exactly how to prevent abortion, prevent unwanted pregnancy. Here's how you do it now, but we don't like those things. And it's about if you have unprotected sex, you should have to deal with the consequences because that's sort of what's right and moral. In the same ways, we've seen it's cheaper to house and give health insurance to the homeless than it is to absorb the social costs of them being on the street. Well, no, it doesn't fit into the morality. I feel like there's something similar in what you're describing, and an obstacle to me seems the political side of it.
I think that's exactly right. That we've turned a lot of what are really public health and political and economic problems into questions of morality, and that fits with a kind of broader ideology that says that the problems of crime and disorder are the result of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to punitive interventions. And what this does is it lets politicians off the hook for actually addressing things like housing market failures and labor market failures and discrimination in education and employment. And so they don't have to take responsibility for that anymore because the problem is those people and their bad morality. And I think one really powerful example you'll be interested in is Operation Relentless Pursuit, which is the Trump administration's big new tough on crime initiative where they're going to flood 7 US cities with federal agents and money for local police to get Trump's favorite bugaboos, the drug cartels and the gangbangers.
Yeah.
And what this is about is saying that the problems of Detroit and Cleveland and Memphis and Baltimore are not a failed federal policy on housing, jobs, health insurance. No, it's the gangbangers. It's the drug cartels. And this is exactly the process that we have to interrupt.
We've been speaking with Alex Vitale, who's professor of sociology at Brooklyn College. The book is The End of Policing. Alex, I really appreciate your time and your insights.
My pleasure, Dave.